So, in this session, we're going to be talking about restoring trust through co production, hope, hype, or hard design. Let's start with something that sounds almost self evident. If we involve people more, trust will improve. That idea feels right. It feels democratic. It feels hopeful. And for the last several decades, public institutions have acted on exactly that assumption. As trust declined, the response was predictable: more engagement, more participation, more collaborative governance, and more co production. But here's a hard question that we're going to wrestle with today. What if participation by itself doesn't restore trust? What if involvement is not automatically trust building? The article we're examining, Restoring Trust Through Co-Production of Public Services by Felderus and colleagues, takes that assumption head on. And this is where it gets interesting. The authors are not anti-participation. They're not arguing against engagement. What they are pushing back against is something far more subtle and, frankly, far more dangerous: wishful thinking. They ask a sharper question: under what specific conditions does co production actually build trust? And just as importantly, under what conditions does it fail? That shift matters because in public leadership, especially high stakes environment like public safety, participation is often presented as a moral good. Sometimes we should do it because it sounds right. But this article refuses to treat co production as a virtual signal. Instead, it treats it as a design problem. Trust, the author argued, is not a byproduct. It is not a guaranteed outcome. It does not have automatically emerged because people were invited to the table. Trust is contingent on the following. What? It depends on power dynamics. It depends on structure. It depends on incentives. It depends on how participation is framed and experienced. And sometimes, this is the uncomfortable part, co production can actually erode trust. If expectations are raised and not met, if responsibility is shifted without real authority, and if participation feels symbolic rather than meaningful, there's going to be detrimental effect. That's not just ineffective, that's corrosive. So today, we're not going to treat co production as a buzzword. We're going to treat it as a mechanism, a symptom, a set of design choices that can either strengthen legitimacy or undermine it. The goal isn't to decide whether co production is good or bad. The goal is to understand the mechanisms that connect it to trust. Because once you understand mechanisms, you can design for outcomes. And that's where this discussion becomes practical. By the end of the session, you should be able to look at engagement efforts in your own agency and ask the following: are we building trust intentionally, or are we assuming it will show up on its own? And that's the lens we'll use as we move forward to the rest of this session. Trust in public institution hasn't just dipped, it's been declining for decades. So governments responded in a predictable way: more participation, more engagement, and more co production. Here's the problem the authors identified: participation is often treated as inherently trust building, but rarely do we stop and ask how trust actually develops. The article matters because it refuses that shortcut. Instead of assuming that trust will emerge, it forces us to theorize it first and design for it intentionally. Think about that. To design for it intentionally. Felder and colleagues make a sharp observation. Co production is widely praise but poorly understood. Most claims about trust are vague at best, normative, and weakly connected to evidence. So the authors don't ask, is co production good and bad? They ask an even better question: what mechanism could plausibly connect co production to trust, and what gets in its way? That shift from advocacy to analysis is the real value of this piece. Definition matters here, and the authors are very precise. For them, co production means the following: clients and professional service providers jointly contributing at the point of service delivery. Okay, I'm going to say this one more time. Clients and professional service providers jointly contributing at the point of service delivery. This is not consultation. This is not public comment. It's not an advisory board. It's what happens when service users actively shape how services are delivered. That narrow definition is intentional because theory falls apart when concept gets sloppy. Here's why boundaries matter so much. If we only study voluntary participation, we mostly observe people who already trust the government. I want you to think about it. Who usually shows up at our meetings? That creates a serious selection problem. Mandatory or structured co production, think welfare to work programs, reveal very different trust dynamics. So before asking whether co production builds trust, we have to ask this: who is participating and under what conditions? Trust isn't just a warm, abstract concept, it affects compliance, cooperation, willingness to accept governmental decisions, and the cost of government. When trust is low, institutions compensate by monitoring, controlling, and enforcing. Early reforms focused very heavily on efficiencies, but they neglected the rational foundation of trust. Co production can reopen that rational space, but only if it's designed carefully. This is one of the article's most important conceptual moves. The authors distinguish three types of trust: calculus based trust, built on incentives and sanctions; knowledge based trust, built on information and transparency; and identification based trust, built on shared goals and mutual understanding. Their key claim is this: co production primarily affects identification based trust. That's the deepest form of trust and also the hardest to create. The first proposed mechanism is self efficacy. The logic sounds straightforward. When people participate meaningfully, they feel more capable, less vulnerable, and more in control. That sense of agency makes trust rational. But here's the catch: people with the lowest self efficacy are also often the least likely to participate in the first place. So co production can unintentionally exclude the very people it is supposed to empower. This creates an interesting paradox. Self efficacy is both a precondition for participation and a potential outcome of participation. Without careful design, co production can reinforce inequality rather than reduce it. Trust doesn't just emerge, it has to be cultivated, especially along those who start from a position of disadvantage. The second mechanism involves trust networks. Co production often happens in small groups over time with shared responsibility. Repeated interactions matter. And at this point, I want to share a quick thought. When I was a deputy county manager, I had a board member who always told me that meetings needed at least three phases at the very minimum. The first meeting is nothing more to introduce yourself, to become familiar. The second meeting is to really hash through and work through the issues and concerns. And the third meeting is where you can have some meaningful discussion. And as we talked about with Escobar, some real dialogue about moving things forward. Well, this is sort of along that same vein. Think housing cooperatives, neighborhood safety initiatives, restorative justice program. Trust here doesn't grow from promises, it grows from coordinated action. But trust networks are not automatically democratic. Strong internal bonds can have this effect. They can exclude outsiders, harden the boundaries, increase free riding, and replace accountability with informal pressure. So trust can grow inward while declining outward. And that tension matters in public governance. This is where the article becomes sobering. Poorly designed co production can have the following effects: crowd out intrinsic motivation, shift responsibility without real power associated with it, increase blame when outcomes fail, and ultimately erode the trust that you've been working to build. The authors are quite explicit in this regard. Co production can erode trust, not build it. Participation is not a moral shield. Which brings us to their central conclusions. There is no automatic relationship between co production and trust. Trust outcomes are contingent, they depend on initial trust levels, motivation structures, power asymmetrics, accountability design, and time. Short term participation does not equal long term trust. To make this practical, the authors propose a three-phase model. Before co production, who participates and what expectations? During co production, what happens to self efficacy and leadership? And after co production, what changes in trust towards services, institutions, and others? Trust has to be examined over time, not assumed at the end. For practitioners, the takeaway is clear. Co production is not a shortcut to legitimacy. Trust has to be designed into the roles, responsibilities, feedback loops, and accountability structures. Participation without power is not empowerment. In public safety, these lessons are even more pronounced. Much co production is compulsory. Power asymmetrics are high, and trust deficits are often really deep. When engagement fails, which looks like resistance is often just a rational response to a poor design. And that's not a community problem, that's an institutional one. So we've covered a lot, and here's the bottom line. Co-production can restore trust, but only under the specific conditions. Trust emerges through identifiable mechanisms. Design choices determine outcomes. When trust declines, look first at the design, not the public. As you prepare for class discussions, I want you to consider this. Under what conditions could co-production realistically increase your trust in your agency? And where might it fail? And that's where theory stops being abstract and starts informing leadership decisions. Thank you for viewing this module. I look forward to further class discussions. Have a good day.